Hello and welcome back. This is part 2 of the Week 9 lecture. So we'll move into Edgar Allan Poe now, but I just wanted to put a bow on part 1 by sort of just reminding you with both of those stories that we were talking about, Sleepy Hollow and My Kinsman, we sort of get this portrait of America that really emerges from both Irving and Hawthorne. We get this picture of a really rapidly industrializing, modernizing place where it's really kind of a bustling center of commerce, trade, urban growth, and some degree of political unrest. And, we're sort of tapping back into maybe some earlier periods, but much of that is meant to represent America as it was in the second, third, maybe fourth decades of the 19th century. So just kind of notice that. That's a through line that we can find connecting Irving to Hawthorne. And another thing that we'll notice about all the stuff that we're reading this week, even though it is quite different in many ways, all of it, at least to some extent, is spooky and a little bit scary. So that brings us to Poe, another member of the American Renaissance, that group of writers from around the middle of the 19th century who would later be sort of immortalized and lionized by scholars and critics. Poe was actually not always included with the original group, but within about a decade or so, he had been sort of added by those same scholars and critics who came along about 100 years later. So for much of the 20th century, Poe was sort of talked about in the same breath as a Hawthorne or as a Melville. Not just important because he wrote good literature, but important as kind of a visionary, kind of a trailblazer, both with his use of genre. Also, some of what he talked about and wrote about as a critic. As somebody who reviewed other writers, other works of literature, and also somebody who kind of worked out theories about writing, particularly writing short stories, again, at a time when short stories were still pretty new. So Poe was important on a lot of levels. We sort of remember a certain version of Poe, and it is representative of a lot of what Poe wrote. So often the first word that comes to mind if we're playing word association and we're thinking about Poe, a word that often gets thrown around is horror, or maybe Gothic. And oftentimes, Poe is thought of as kind of the father of Gothic horror in American literature. And that might be fair. I mean, we've seen Freneau, we've seen Brown, some earlier writers also kind of working within that Gothic register, but certainly they weren't as successful as Poe, so we could argue that Poe does it better. But one thing I just wanted to start with today was maybe trying to gain a greater appreciation of Poe and all of his complexity, and just to try to understand all of the different stuff that he wrote and did. Obviously, we're only going to read a very small fraction of his larger catalog, but I just want you guys to understand that Poe didn't only write Gothic horror. That wasn't the only genre that he used. In fact, he wrote a lot of stuff. He wrote comedies. He wrote what we might consider now as sort of like proto-science fiction. He wrote detective fiction. He was one of the first American writers to really work within that young genre. He didn't invent it. Sometimes he's given credit for inventing detective fiction. We're pretty sure that there were some French examples and some other European examples of detective fiction from like back in the 1700s, but he was one of the first American writers to really popularize detective stories. He also wrote what he sort of called tales of the occult. And these are often scary, but they're specifically about supernatural events, things that were kind of unexplainable, phenomena that went beyond science or medicine. And then, of course, yes, he has the Gothic horror stuff that he's probably best remembered for. But he also wrote he was a journalist, he was a critic, he was an editor, he helped to run a lot of newspapers and like literary magazines, many of them folded. But he was a very active member of this sort of larger American literary scene. Remember, with Brown, we talked about how he was sort of at the very beginning of that. He knew a bunch of poets from New England. Brown created some literary journals where he published young American writers, also published some of his own work. So he was sort of helping to create a literary culture and a literary scene where none had really truly existed before. So Poe's coming along a few decades later and sort of advancing that work, sort of taking that work to the next step. And Hawthorne also published a lot of his stuff in periodicals. Magazines and newspapers back then often featured a lot of literature, sometimes poetry, a lot of times short stories. Sometimes they would publish novels serially. So like, installments of the novel would appear each week or each month or whatever. So these were popular venues for literature, and it was a great way to reach a sort of local, national audience. So Poe's a part of all of that. But also, I want to talk about the way we remember Poe today. Because Poe, much like The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, a lot of Poe's stories kind of live on. Some of his characters, some of his ideas, some of his settings live on. And even, I would argue, the mood or a lot of the sort of atmosphere of his fiction lives on. And it's what we often think about when we think of Poe, even if we haven't necessarily read a lot of Poe. So I'm actually borrowing a lot of this lecture from a professor that I had back in my master's program at the College of Charleston, a small school in South Carolina. One of my professors was kind of a preeminent Poe scholar. I don't say that to boast, that's just the case. Dr. Peoples remains one of the sort of top Poe experts and scholars working in the U.S. He's a good bit older now, but he's still teaching, he's still writing. He actually did a TED Talk about Poe not too long ago. It's one of those like educational TED Talks, so I think they're called like TED Talk Ed, but you can find that on YouTube and watch it for free. It's really good. It's entitled like Why People Should Still Read Poe. But one thing that's made Dr. Peoples quite successful in his later career is that he came up with a really sort of cool idea or kind of a new way of thinking about Poe. And he introduced this to us in his class. I mean, God, that was almost maybe 20 years ago, but I still remember a lot of it, and it's still really operative and important, I think, for us. So I'm just going to recycle a lot of his lecture, and I'm not going to do it justice, but I'll sort of give you the reduced, kind of condensed version. So basically, his argument was that we all know Poe. Right? Like, I don't know if they still have these, but back then you could go to Barnes & Noble, and get one of those like specialty bags that had like the caricature illustrations of like famous writers, and one of them was Poe. And he was saying, you know that's Poe just by looking at the picture, right? We have this image in our minds of who Poe was and kind of the sort of stuff that Poe wrote and his whole kind of style. We have an idea implanted in our minds, and Peoples calls that the Poe effect. And he says this happens with a lot of famous writers. They become so famous that they sort of develop a famous persona that's not always directly connected to their work, right? This can happen with visual artists, maybe filmmakers. It certainly happens with writers, where we kind of think we know the writer, at least to some extent, or we know certain things about the writer. And that sort of general understanding will often color our perception of all of that writer's work, because inevitably we haven't read all of their work, or maybe even most of it, or any of it. So we're kind of generalizing, we're making assumptions. Peoples would even argue it's kind of a form of stereotyping. Like, we reduce Poe to this caricature version of himself, where he's this like creepy guy, kind of weird, always very pale. We might know that he battled, substance abuse problems and, often struggled with alcohol addiction. So we might think of him as sort of disheveled, possibly drunk, looking perhaps somewhat unhealthy. And then our conception of his work, again, there's always this emphasis on the Gothic horror. So we think, oh, he wrote creepy, scary stuff. He was kind of a weird, creepy guy. We might know that he died young under kind of mysterious circumstances. He was found in the streets of Baltimore, where he had been dead for some time and was probably lying out in the street for a while before anybody found him. It's often been thought that he was maybe on a drinking bender and just overindulged. Other people thought he might have been killed. He might have been murdered for various reasons. So we might have picked up a few of those scraps, a few of those threads of his biography, some things that we might know about his work, and people's called that the Poe effect. It's this ability for the writer to live on in our popular culture, even as we increasingly forget his work. We grow more and more distant from his actual texts, and instead we just kind of play around with our general image of Poe, this general idea we have of him that's persisted for a long time. So again, even if we haven't read him, we kind of think we know what he's about. That's the Poe effect. And Dr. Peoples argues that it's both a good thing and a bad thing. He says it's a good thing because it keeps Poe alive, and it keeps Poe somewhat relevant. But he says the negative side of it is it doesn't necessarily make more people read Poe. It just makes people think they know Poe, when in reality they might not, or they don't know the full extent of Poe. And it just got me thinking, at the time, of all of the examples of Poe in popular culture that I could remember or think of. Because, embarrassing as it was for me to admit, I had made it all the way to my master's program without really having read that much Poe. Like, I had maybe read Annabel Lee, maybe The Raven, maybe The Fall of the House of Usher as an undergrad. But that was probably it. And I didn't know that he wrote other stuff besides Gothic horror. I really didn't. So it was pretty revelatory to me to hear all of this, because a lot of what he was saying sort of tracked with my own experience and the way I thought of Poe. I thought he was this creepy guy, and there really wasn't much more to him. And I also thought about the great Simpsons version of The Raven that appeared in one of their Treehouse of Horror episodes from, I want to say, maybe the early 90s. I mean, it's quite old now, but it's a really good version with James Earl Jones reading the poem. He recently passed away, but they do condense it a little bit. They cut out a few lines of the original text, but it's still a really good rendition, kind of spooky and also funny. So I thought of that. I thought of seeing Poe in like comics. He shows up in animated shows. He gets referenced a lot. You guys can probably find some examples on your own. There was a recent show that I watched, well, not so recent now, it was on several years ago, called Altered Carbon. Many of you might know that. I think it started life as a graphic novel or a comic, and it was later made into a Netflix show. And in season 1, it's like set in the future, and in season 1 there's actually a Poe character, like he's AI, but he's been created as sort of like a simulation of the real Poe, and he's this kind of diminutive guy, but again, it's like an AI, like a hologram. It's not a real person, but he pops up. He looks like the stereotypical sort of image of Poe. He recites creepy lines from poems. He's actually a pretty delightful character. He becomes kind of the sidekick of the hero, but again, doesn't matter. All those details don't matter. The point is, Peoples is right. Poe shows up in a lot of pop culture. He shows up in TV, movies, comics, and sometimes we might get some quotes from his actual work, but often we're just trafficking in that image of Poe. The creepy, scary guy, the Gothic horror guy, the drunk, maybe high guy who's kind of having visions or is somewhat disconnected from reality. That's often how we think of them. And just a final note on the Poe effect before we move on. In class, people showed us a couple of old horror movies. I might try to find some links for you guys to check out in the module. But one of them was a 1930s, I think it was the 30s, horror film starring, I want to say Bela Lugosi, the guy who played the original Dracula. But the movie was called The Raven, and it was sort of promoted and sold as a film adaptation of the poem. But if you actually watch the movie, or just read about it, it has nothing really to do with the poem. It's about this like mad scientist who's torturing people, and I don't even remember. He's doing this series of weird experiments, and like he has a pet raven that like hangs out with him while he's doing the torturous experiment. So it doesn't really have anything to do with the actual poem, with the actual substance of the poem. They're just sort of tapping into that mood or atmosphere associated with Poe. The idea of the creepiness, the horror, and that's really what gets remembered the most. But this was all kind of a big preface for peoples to make the argument that you really need to know Poe more extensively. You need to go kind of beyond the obvious and learn a little bit more about all the different stuff that he did. So we don't have time to do Poe's career justice. But again, I just would remind you of some of those other genres that I mentioned. The crime fiction, comedy. We're not seeing examples of the comedy, but you can read an example of detective fiction in The Purloined Letter. That's one of the optional texts that I provided. If you want to get a feel for that, in terms of tone and style, those are very different from the Gothic horror. There's kind of a sly humor going on with the detective fiction. They have what's sometimes called a kind of drawing room quality, a little bit more reminiscent of like 18th century European fiction, which Poe was very much influenced by. But if you want to get an example of it, and oftentimes his characterization in some of those detective stories like Murders in the Rue Morgue and The Purloined Letter are often thought to have set the stage for Sherlock Holmes and other famous detective characters in future fiction. So Poe's character of Dupin, this sort of French detective, is often thought of as kind of a predecessor for Sherlock. And then there's sort of a less perceptive sidekick that some people think sort of sets the stage for Watson. So those stories were influential for a whole later crop of detective fiction. And again, he helps to popularize detective stories in America. He also wrote stuff that we would call science fiction. He wrote stuff that was very kind of topical, like satire of current events. And I used to assign some of those stories like The Man That Was Used Up. That's, I think, in the PDF that I included this week, but you don't have to read it. I mean, feel free to if you want, but a lot of that humor is lost on us. You have to do a lot of research to kind of get familiar with the historical context so that you can understand what he's sort of making fun of. But he operates in a lot of different registers. He wrote a lot of different kinds of texts, and it's also worth remembering that he really starts his career as a poet. And his early publications were mostly poetry, and then later he increasingly wrote short stories. Another thing that we remember, a couple of other things with Poe, like I mentioned, he was a critic. So he wasn't just writing fiction and poetry, he was also reviewing fiction and poetry written by others, American writers, English writers. So he was, again, helping to create a larger literary culture. And he also had personal relationships with some of the other prominent writers of that period. Or if he didn't know them personally, he at least read their work and maybe even reviewed their work and wrote about them in some of the periodicals that he helped to manage. So that was part of his larger importance as well. And then we also remember an idea or a theory that he had known as the unity of effect. So Poe did attempt to write a novel, the narrative of Gordon Pym, but that was really his only finished novel. For the most part, he stuck to shorter texts. And he kind of had an idea behind that. So he talks about this thing, the unity of effect, and it was discussed in an essay he wrote called The Philosophy of Composition. And this is very much kind of his own personal approach or strategy to writing. And he talks a lot about structure. And he's sort of rebutting this idea of inspiration, this kind of old romantic notion that had existed really since like antiquity, that a writer would sit down and sort of be touched by the muse or, struck by some kind of divine inspiration that would allow them to write, to create some, great work. Poe said, that's not really how writing is. You need to have a plan. You need to have a structure in order to be successful in what you're doing. So he talks about the structure that he uses when he goes about composing his work, and that's how he talks about the unity of effect, which is basically the idea that any really successful text, well, first of all, it needs to be able to be consumed in a single sitting. So that's why he favored poetry and short fiction, because he thought that was the best way to really land the strongest effect, was for the reader to be able to sit down and consume the text in a single sitting. But as far as what his strategy was for his unity of effect, what that means is really just making sure that everything in the text is unified and it's all working towards that overall effect that the author is going for, the effect that they want to have on the reader. So everything in the text, the characters, the dialogue, the setting, if it's a poem, the meter, the rhyme scheme, the way stanzas are arranged, all of that has to be unified in the sense that it's all working together to create that larger effect that Poe would want to have on his readers. And again, the effect was not always to scare us. The effect was not always to make us feel spooky or melancholy, even though that's often what we remember. Sometimes he wanted to make us laugh. Sometimes he wanted us to try to solve a puzzle or a crime. There were lots of different intended effects. But the idea was everything in the story or everything in the poem is working towards that effect. And he claimed that was the most effective way to write. That was the most effective way to deliver a message or a meaning to an audience. And he would claim that, creating this consistent kind of unified effect is the primary purpose of any successful piece of writing. So we can kind of see him doing that in a lot of his writing, but also that was just the way he thought, writing should be. So it was sort of a larger theory that he had about composition, about actually composing fiction, and it also governed much of his own writing. So again, he was interested in length and he was interested in method. He thought most fiction, he made some exceptions, but he thought most fiction in particular should be short and digestible. Again, meaning that the reader could sit down and get through it in a single sitting. And that is how most of his short stories continue to function even today. They are slower going for modern readers than they would have been in the 19th century, but I would argue that you can still usually get through them, in a single day. So you can see a few different examples of the different genres in the optional writing. So again, in the optional selections that I've provided for this week. So if you look at that PDF, I want you to read all the poems in the PDF, the file that's just called Poe PDF. Try to get through all of those poems, but the only short stories that you have to read in there will be The Fall of the House of Usher and The Man in the Crowd. Okay, the others are optional. So William Wilson, Hop Frog, and I believe, no, actually, you can't read Murders in the Rue Morgue because that gets cut off in that PDF. But if you want the example of detective fiction, I have posted the Purloined Letter on the main module page. So I don't know if we are going to get to any of the comedy or the sci-fi, but I can always provide more if anybody's interested. At the very least, we're going to get plenty of examples of the Gothic terror, and that is what he's best known for. As we've said, Hop Frog is comic. The Man Who Was Used Up is comic, very typical of his sort of topical satire. Hop Frog is kind of a grotesque comedy, I would say, but still pretty funny. And again, the Purloined Letter is an example of detective fiction, and I might just throw one additional text up there, maybe one of his tales of ratiocination, which is a ratiocination, I don't know how to say it, basically related to detective fiction, but more like mystery tales. They're kind of like puzzles that are intended for the reader to solve. So like The Gold Bug is one of the more famous examples of those. I might post that, and maybe an example of his proto sort of science fiction, like maybe The Balloon Hoax, or The Facts in the Case of M. Valdemar. I'm still toying around with some of those because normally we would read a lot more Poe. But now I'm condensing. So we're mostly just going to look at the Gothic horror. So you can read the introduction to some of the short fiction in that PDF, even though you're not reading all of the short fiction. There's a really good intro written by another Poe scholar named G.R. Thompson, and he talks about some of these major styles that Poe is often associated with and often working within. So the Gothic obviously gets a lot of treatment, and we're already familiar with the Gothic because we've talked about Freneau and we've talked about Brown. So we already know some of the sort of classic traits of Gothic fiction, especially as it got handed down from our English and British Isles predecessors. So, you know, scary castles, superstition, fantastical or supernatural events. These were popular tales for a long time, and Poe definitely works within that register. In a lot of his most, sort of memorable, famous fiction. But just remember, Gothic gets a lot of uses. Like that word has a lot of different uses. We're just really using it in a literary sense. But there's also kind of a whole history of like Gothic tribes. Like there were actually people called Goths that helped to sack Rome. There's also Gothic architecture. So you want to sort of keep it straight. Like we're talking about Gothic literature, which is a particular usage of the word, and it can differ a little bit from other usages of the word. But remember, in terms of literature, in terms of the Gothic romance that became very popular in Europe during the 18th century, we're talking about really a type of novel, what we would now call novels, that were in many ways predecessors of modern horror. They were designed to be scary. They often had supernatural elements, like we were saying. But again, they were often rooted in the kind of ancient history of Europe. Ancient families, ancestral curses, haunted castles. We got a little bit of that in the Clitheroe narrative from Brown. And Poe works with some of those same materials. And there were, famous English Gothic romance writers like Horace Walpole and Anne Radcliffe, who were very influential to Brown first and Poe later. I'm not sure if Poe read Brown. I tend to think he did. He never really talked much about Brown, but he was probably at least aware of some of Brown's Gothic work. So Thompson, who's writing that intro in the PDF, he writes a pretty nice, succinct description of a lot of Poe's Gothic stuff. So I'll just read this quote quickly. We see lots of tales of mysterious things, isolated personages committing often vile deeds, then melodramatically brooding, alternately indulging forbidden lusts, narcissistically feeling intense remorse, and then that paradoxically further feeds the fires of the passion. Sometimes we have characters that are perhaps possessed demonically. They have interactions with supernatural elements, and oftentimes they were humans experiencing what we might now referred to as psychological breakdowns. One thing that links Hawthorne and Poe a little bit is that they were very interested in psychological darkness and ambiguity. Psychological states that were difficult to govern, difficult to understand. Brown, too, was sort of interested in those, like, phenomenon that couldn't be explained by science, stuff like sleepwalking, stuff that people didn't fully understand. But one thing critics have argued about the Renaissance figures is that they were all very interested in psychology. They were all sort of amateur, armchair, psychologists, and they really plumbed the mental states of their characters in a complex way that maybe we didn't necessarily see from some of those earlier American works of lit. So Poe is definitely talked about in that way. So we'll see plenty of examples of his use of Gothic romance. The Fall of the House of Usher is the prime example. It is quintessential Poe Gothic romance. It's very much how he did it, and it's still a popular story. It's influenced a lot of other works, and it's also been adapted to movies, and it shows up in cartoons and comics and other forms of media as well. But just very quickly, to stick with Thompson and that PDF for a moment, he also talks about the grotesque. And this is a term that I think we need to spend just a moment on to think about a little bit more, because it doesn't just show up in Poe, although many would argue that Poe helps to popularize the use of the grotesque in American letters. But I would argue that there's a long tradition of American writers using elements of the grotesque. Flannery O'Connor, to use one 20th century example, is often thought of as sort of using this same sort of stylistic feature. So just to keep it brief and to use Thompson's definition, he refers to the grotesque as basically a way to refer to things that were disturbing, unreal, or maybe somewhat nightmarish. But also, he argues that there was this kind of coexisting denotation of surreal absurdity and even humor. So this idea that there's kind of an uneasy relationship between horror and humor. Like, what the audience is seeing terrifies them on some level. It's disturbing to them. But it also might make them laugh, or at the very least, it strikes them as kind of surreal or just so absurd that they can't help but laugh, even though they're also kind of scared and disturbed. I would argue this is a very difficult register to explain or define, but I think most of us have experienced it. And again, this is kind of part of why Poe is so important, right? A lot of what he was doing has really stayed with us, stylistically and in terms of genre, even though it's obviously been updated to more modern times. But this very kind of precarious perch between humor and horror, I think we still get a lot of that in our scary movies, both in cinema and TV shows. I think we get this in graphic novels. I think we see it in a lot of different forms of media. And sometimes it is sort of attributed to Poe, much like the Gothic, but the grotesque really does, like the Gothic, it lives on. Plenty of other writers use it. And it can be used, it doesn't really refer so much to subject matter. I would argue it refers to mood. To use more of a modern parlance, it refers to vibes, the way that the reader feels, the sensations that the reader is getting. Sometimes you can refer to specific characters as grotesque. And you'll often hear about this with O'Connor, with her short stories. She has a lot of grotesque characters who might be sort of ugly or disturbing, either in a way that might have been thought of as physical or in terms of their moral composition, right? They might be corrupt or sort of duplicitous in some way, but in some cases they might even have like some kind of like physical deformity or something about them, about their physical appearance that might sort of revolt people or make people turn away. But again, it can also refer to their inner state, right? Their inner condition. So the grotesque can refer to characters, but it can also just refer to a style, a mood, an atmosphere that certain stories kind of tap into. So if you want to get a good example, Hop Frog, the final story contained within that PDF of Poe, that's very much what I think we would call a grotesque comedy. And it really captures what Thompson means by the grotesque, both physically grotesque in a way that might strike us as kind of mean or judgmental, but also it's very kind of absurd. It's sort of surreal. It has some nightmarish qualities, but there's also humor contained within it. So it's a very interesting stew. And even there's often a lot of overlap between Gothic and grotesque. So again, going back to Flannery O'Connor, she's often considered to be a Southern Gothic writer who often employs grotesque characters or stories as part of her larger sort of Gothic style. So these two kind of go together. And again, Poe is helping to create templates, genres, and styles that we can still notice today. We can still find examples of today. Oh yeah, I was just going to throw one more example of the grotesque out. This wasn't my original idea. Somebody suggested this to me. But if you guys are familiar with the films of the Greek director Yorgos Lanthimos, I believe he's the one that did The Lobster, Killing of a Sacred Deer, The Favorite, his most recent one, I think, was Poor Things. His films are sometimes referred to as grotesque, both because, like, again, it's operative on multiple levels. Like, some grotesque stuff is happening in the films, like literally, like physically grotesque, but also a lot of his films kind of have that surreal, absurdist quality where they seem to really transcend the bounds of like realism or everyday life. The characters might often be doing kind of vile things, but there's also humor. There's times where we're also laughing. We might be laughing while also cringing or wincing or like shutting our eyes, but that's very much the effect of the grotesque. So, yeah, it's still with us in a lot of forms. All right, but let's just talk about the fall of the House of Usher a little bit because it is such a classic example of a work of Gothic terror from Poe. So again, a classic example of this kind of Gothic romance in short story form. It's a very creepy story. Poe is using a lot of classic tropes that would have been common in a lot of other Gothic romance. So again, this is a great example of the larger genre, and it's often just thought of as really instrumental in the creation of kind of unique American horror. Now, not so much in terms of subject matter here, because we do have an ancient family and the castle and a lot of the sort of raw materials of the Gothic that we might have seen from earlier English models. But he is, in his own way, still adapting that material to America, if nothing else, by virtue of being an American writer, publishing in the U.S., and helping to create a bigger, more vibrant U.S. literary scene. So, and again, we might just notice, and we probably already know without even having read Poe, the Poe effect, we know that Poe is helping to create a lot of conventions, a lot of particular features that have really become horror staples throughout America and really throughout other parts of the world, because Poe eventually would be influential in other parts of the world as well. So a few just classic features of Poe's Gothic writing. A lot of gloomy weather, desolate landscapes, scary castles, and the death of a beautiful woman. There's a quote from Poe. I think it's Poe himself, or it might have been somebody talking about Poe. I can't quite remember. It might be apocryphal, but there's a quote I think attributed to him that says, there's nothing more romantic or nothing lends itself better to a work of literature than the death of a beautiful woman. So that has kind of become a joke, because you can notice in a lot of his poetry and a lot of his short fiction, a lot of the narrative does revolve around the death of a beautiful, often a very young woman. And there's some biographical connections that some people make. Poe did marry his own cousin, which was not uncommon back then. She was quite young when they got married. It would not be legal now. She died young. She was, I think, tuberculosis. She was very sickly. But that was a great tragedy in Poe's life, and she becomes probably an influence for a lot of his female characters, but it's debatable because he was probably using a similar trope even before she died. So definitely a lot of death, but also this kind of simultaneous fixation on death and aesthetic beauty. And sometimes the desire to preserve beauty even after death. And that can sometimes lead to disastrous results for a lot of his characters. You can see that in Ligeia, another one of the optional texts that I provided for this week. We kind of see it with Usher as well. Also, an idea that pops up a lot for him is this concept that the arrangement of natural objects, objects in the natural world, the physical world, can sometimes generate fantasies or dream-like mental states. So he was very influenced by the Romantic poets of the early 19th century in England, but he sort of gravitated more towards the darker strains of that Romantic poetry. Not so much the nature stuff of Wordsworth, but more the dark romanticism of maybe a Lord Byron or a Coleridge or a Shelley. And again, this concept of the sublime is kind of connected to this. We talked about it with Brown, the idea that we can observe beautiful sights in nature, like huge mountains or waterfalls, or a vast tract of forest, or an endless ocean, and we can be struck by the aesthetic beauty of these things, but we're also a little bit scared of them. We're also in awe of these things because they're more powerful than us, they're older than us, they're indifferent to us. So while we admire their beauty, we're also filled with a little bit of terror. I mean, that's really what they meant with the sublime. There's some terror. There's a sense of being overwhelmed, in addition to appreciating, how pretty it might be. So that's also kind of connected to what Poe's doing. And we see a little bit of an example early in Usher. So that's an idea that shows up. Also, the unity of effect that Poe writes about, I think, is operative here. I mean, everything in the story is kind of unified. It's all working together to create a singular overall effect on the readers. There's also kind of this ancient notion that shows up a lot in Gothic literature of a sort of supernatural relationship between people and maybe like the physical space they inhabit, like the buildings, the homes, the castles that they live in. So we kind of see that here. There's a weird relationship between the Ushers, this ancient, brilliant, but also probably inbred family, and the decaying castle, their decaying ancestral castle, that we spend most of the story in. But we also have a character that I think modern readers would probably perceive as clearly mentally ill in Roderick Usher. He is suffering from what is described in the text as a morbid acuteness of the senses. And this, if you've ever read The Telltale Heart, this might put you in mind of that narrator as well, who suffers from a similar affliction, which the way Poe kind of explains it or understands it just means that his senses are sharpened to an almost unbearable degree. Like he can detect so much that it's almost driving him crazy. So there's that famous passage in The Telltale Heart where the narrator's sort of claiming not to be crazy, and he says, "Have I not told you that what you mistake for madness is but over acuteness of the senses? Above all was the sense of hearing acute. I heard all things in the heaven and in the earth. I heard many things in hell." So, of course, that sets the stage for the narrator of that story to go crazy by hearing his friend, the old guy, his neighbor, like sleeping, but also he could imagine that he saw the evil eye, right? So his senses are so acute, he's perceiving so much that it eventually makes him go mad. So Roderick Usher is sort of experiencing something similar in the story. So also a thing to notice here that was pretty characteristic of Gothic romances in general, and also Poe's use of the genre in particular, is the text within a text. So we actually have a couple of these with Usher. We have the poem that Usher recites to the narrator, his friend, while playing a wild improvisation on his speaking guitar. So that's a poem that sort of functions as a text within the text. And then later, so that one was called, The Haunted Palace, which was actually a poem written by Poe, published separately back in 1839. So that's an original Poe composition. And then later, we get sort of references to a fictional work of medieval romance, which is called in the story The Mad Tryst of Sir Lancelot Canning. Now, critics and historians, as far as we know, that's not a real text. It's imagined by Poe. But again, it's like a chivalric romance, the kind that Don Quixote read, the kind that Brackenridge is kind of satirizing in modern chivalry, that sort of older pre-novel form of prose fiction that was very popular throughout the Middle Ages. So we get an example of that kind of text as well, as Usher attempts to, share some of that. So we have a lot of different kind of lore and sort of these references to old texts, ancient texts, and some of the titles in Usher's library really were real books, and then others were probably imagined, made up by Poe. And if you read Ligeia, a similar thing. There's a text within a text, The Conquering Worm, another poem written by Poe, but it appears in the text and it plays a role within the fictive universe of that text. Poe doesn't really acknowledge it as just a separate work of his own. It has a life of its own within the short story. And that's kind of how The Haunted Palace and Sir Lancelot function in Usher. So the texts within the larger text, they help to move the plot forward. And in the case of the medieval romance, some of the stuff happening in the narrative, right, is sort of mirrored or echoed in what's actually happening, what the characters are actually hearing in the castle. And just to go back, I had another example that I wanted to, if I can find it. Yeah, so just going back to one of those earlier ideas about how the natural world can put you in a certain frame of mind that's often very spooky and will, again, sort of achieve that unity of effect. Notice when the narrator first arrives at the castle and he's sort of struck by the oppressive and scary atmosphere. And he's in particular looking at this tarn, which is sort of like a small, kind of swampy body of water. And he's sort of depressed by the sight. He's kind of, not feeling particularly good because the arrangement of nature, in this case, the arrangement of these physical items, these physical things, objects, make him feel a certain way. But he thinks, at least briefly, that that is the narrator, thinks that if he changes his perception, or I'm sorry, his perspective, if he changes his location, where he's standing, the way he's looking at the castle, he thinks that that might sort of brighten his mood and make him feel better. If he's able to view these natural objects from a different vantage point, he thinks that he might be filled with less fear and less dread. But it doesn't really work, because everything he sees works to confirm that initial impression he has. So not just the silent tarn, but also the Gothic archway of the castle itself. Everything contributes to how he feels. So this is almost a fictional playing out of the unity of effect. Everything here, everything on Usher's estate is working together to make this dude feel uneasy, scared, and a bit trepidatious. So I think we even have a quote. I have a quote from him here. Much that I encountered on the way contributed, I know not how, to heighten the vague sentiments of which I have already spoken. And those vague sentiments were of horror and dread and this general sense of uneasiness. So even before the scary stuff starts happening, even before Roderick, his friend, starts acting really erratic, already just the place, the setting, the arrangement of natural objects already creates a bit of a gothic, spooky atmosphere, and then it just continues to get sort of heightened and accelerated from there. So, again, a really characteristic story if we're thinking about Poe's use of the Gothic. I think I sort of want to stop there as far as the short stories go. I wanted to save a little bit of time for the poems. But now, of course, my notes are all mixed up. Okay. So again, if you have time for some of those optional short stories, check them out, but the only two required short stories for Poe will be Usher and The Man in the Crowd, which is kind of a tough one to categorize. It's a little bit gothic too, little bit spooky, but it's also kind of an interesting commentary on urban life. It's a tough one. It's a little bit more of a miscellaneous text, and I would like to hear what you guys have to say about it. I'm not going to talk about it now, but that is the other required short story. All the rest in the PDF or on the main module page are optional. Okay, so let's move to some of his poems. I know a lot of us might be less enthusiastic about reading poems, but for Poe, we need to appreciate the poetry because he really was a poet first. And he was a very influential poet, and that's a big part of his legacy. So I've included some of his best hits in the PDF. So that contains For Annie, The Bells, pretty sure Annabelle Lee is the last one in there, El Dorado, some of his best remembered, best known poems. And I've also included The Raven on the main module page. So those are all required. The poems in the PDF and then The Raven, which is not in the PDF, but I have included it separately in the Week 9 module. So none of those should take you a terribly long time to read. And just try to work your way through them, but really do pay attention a little bit to the poetic form of those texts, because Poe's really a master of meter and rhyme, and just like we saw with the short stories, he's not just about Gothic horror. Like, not all of his poems are tapping into that register or that genre, but a lot of them do. So there is a reason why we often remember him that way, because like his short stories, he shows a real knack in his poetry of being able to kind of access the inner state or the inner mind of distressed or kind of mentally disordered people. And often the speakers in his poems might be suffering through again, what we might recognize as a breakdown or just a state of heightened anxiety, or they're just going through it, to put it simply. And he really does capture that frame of mind in a way that still seems pretty authentic. And that's where some of the scariness comes from too, as we really begin to realize that these characters are not well, and they might be suffering from delusions. They might be misunderstanding or misapprehending reality. And that's where some of the thrills and scares come from. And that's also part of the art that we can appreciate in his work. So I thought we could take just a few moments with The Raven, his most famous work of poetry. Another one of these texts that we've heard of. We probably know, at least vaguely, what it's about, even if we've never read it. We've become somewhat disconnected from the original text itself. And like I was telling you, that old movie that was called The Raven but had virtually nothing to do with The Raven. So let's try to appreciate this poem on a deeper level, not just the Poe effect version, not just the pop culture version that has kind of persisted in a lot of different media forms, but let's really dig in to the poem a little bit, because it was popular with audiences and also critically acclaimed both during its time and later. So it's remembered in large part now for its structure. I would say even if people don't realize that they enjoy the structure, they probably do, because it's the structure that creates the rhythm and the patterns that we're able to detect as we're reading it. It's an especially fun poem to listen to. If you can listen to somebody read it, recite it out loud, you'll really be able to notice the rhythmic qualities of a poem, of this poem. And anytime we're thinking about rhythm in a poem, that really demands that we look more closely at the meter and the rhyme scheme, because those are the poetic features that often create what we perceive as rhythm or a sort of flow as we read or listen. So we won't get too far into this. This is not a class specifically about prosody and, meter, but we need to know a little bit about this stuff. Okay, just a bit. So if we notice the structure of the text, we'll notice that we have 18 stanzas. Each one consists of 6 lines. And the meter stays pretty consistent throughout. He does deviate a little, but for the most part, he's using trochaic octameter in this poem. So, okay, what does that mean? Well, let's just think about meter more broadly for a moment. When we're talking about rhythm, we often are talking about feet. And feet are the way we sort of measure syllables, or the way syllables are arranged. So there's different units of metrical feet. The one that we're probably the most familiar with English language poetry is the iamb. I-A-M-B. We probably would recognize iambic pentameter because that's the most common type of meter in English language poetry. Shakespeare used it a lot. A lot of other famous English playwrights and poets used it, and it still gets used a lot today. So the trochee is another type of metrical foot, and really it's kind of the opposite of the more common iamb. So with a trochee, and with almost any metrical foot in English, there's some exceptions, but usually a metrical foot will consist of 2 syllables, okay? It's a 2-part unit. That's the case with an iamb or a trochee. So with a trochee, you have 1 stressed syllable followed by 1 unstressed syllable. And those 2 syllables taken together equals 1 sort of unit. That's 1 trochee, right? That's the opposite of an iamb. With an iamb, again, you get 2 syllables, but it's the inverse. It's 1 unstressed syllable followed by 1 stressed. So for a trochee, it's stressed to unstressed, and with an iamb, it's unstressed to stressed. So they're just kind of the inverse, but they're both common examples of metrical feet. And then we add the number. So with iambic pentameter, if you hear that, all it means is we're using iambs and we're going to have 5 iambs per line. That's what the pentameter part means. So we have 5 iambs per line. We know that in each iamb we have 2 syllables, so that equals 10 syllables per line. You might have learned at some point in school to count up the syllables when reading poetry. That's an easy way to identify what kind of meter we're dealing with. So in this case, we have trochaic octameter. So that means that we have 8 trochees per line, right? We have 8 trochaic feet per line, right? So that's basically what we're dealing with. So that's how we end up with our meter. And then we also have a pretty regular rhyme scheme. But we also have to account for the internal rhyme. So that can be a little bit tricky. But the general rhyme scheme throughout the Raven is A, B, C, B, B, B. Or, if we're accounting for the internal rhyme, it's A, B, C, 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 B, B, B. And we might notice that in every stanza, the B line rhymes with the word nevermore. So there's a lot of intricate structure here. We don't have to know or talk about all of it, but you should think a little bit about the trochaic octameter. You should think a little bit about the rhyme scheme and how the individual lines and the individual stanzas are actually functioning. So just that might help a little as you move through the poem.